Okay, so hello guys. Today we have Dr. Usue Arana here, so she's going to talk to us about soundscapes. So welcome and off you.
Hi everyone, and thanks Mark for the invitation and Becky for the organization as well. So I'm going to be talking about multi-species soundscapes and how we go about integrating different approaches for it. But before I go into it, I thought it would be quite useful to tell you a little bit about my background to set this talk into context. So I am a chartered landscape architect and a senior lecturer in landscape architecture at Newcastle University, and my research cross-cuts three fields. So I look at acoustic ecology and deep listening, which I'm kind of putting into one, although they're different things. I also look at multi-species collaborations and research by design. And my aim is really to advance landscape architecture as a discipline that is uniquely positioned to address the many planetary crises that we are suffering at the moment. So I don't know how much you know about landscape architecture. It's usually not a very well-known discipline. So we landscape architects combine skills and knowledge within the arts and also within ecology. And this means that when it comes to sound and listening, I combine both creative and technical approaches, and I focus on both humans and other than humans as well. So with that, we move on to the main contents of the talk. I'm going to start with a short contextualization of multi-species soundscapes and their complexities. Then we're going to have a look at some case studies that have attempted to cross over human-centered approaches and non-human-centered approaches to soundscape assessment. And then I will be kind of discussing some of the insights from these case studies, and I'll be talking to you a little bit about where my research is going as well. And then, of course, we can have questions and discussions afterwards as well. So, multi-species soundscapes. The modern human term in the humanities, arts, and natural sciences has brought attention to the agency of the multitude of species that we share our environment with. At a large scale, rivers across the world have been afforded personhood as the basis for legal rights. And at a small scale, at the species scale, advances in the natural sciences have brought us closer to the sentience of a wide range of species, providing the basis for their legal protection. So in this context, the needs and rights of all species must be considered for the design and management of healthy soundscapes for healthy communities. Healthy soundscapes are linked to community health and well-being through, for example, emotional restoration, making a case for their protection and also for their enhancement. So soundscapes, whether healthy or unhealthy, in policy and standards, are understood as perceptual human constructs that depend on contextual and individual variables. So within the ISO 12913 soundscape standard series, for example, a soundscape is defined as the acoustic environment as perceived or experienced and or understood by a person or people in context. This definition built from the acoustic ecology tradition and also from the definition of landscape that came out of the European Landscape Convention of 2000, where a landscape means an area as perceived by people whose character is the result of the action and interaction of natural and or human factors. So we understand the landscape as a dynamic interaction between communities and places and not a mere physical field of study. So this understanding of soundscapes as perceptual constructs has guided the development of standards to assess the soundscape. The methods that the ISO 12913 proposes, for example, and that you might be all familiar with, prioritize the effective evaluation of the soundscape through community soundwalks, to characterize the soundscape through descriptors, which is then supported by acoustic measurements that are geared towards calculating acoustic indicators. The policies that have followed, such as the Noise and Soundscape Plan for Wales, and also quite a wide range of research projects within urban settings, also follow the same approach. And I'm not going to discuss these policies or projects into detail. I would just like to emphasize that despite these policies, in particular the Noise and Soundscape Plan for Wales, recognizing the effects of sound in non-human communities, the practices that have developed to apply those policies are primarily concerned with human affective perception. But humans are not the only ones that listen or sense sound. Rapidly developing research is bringing us closer to how different species respond to sound and how they vocalize or they sound their bodies to communicate. Elephant seals here on the screen, for example, they recognize the call of fellow seals through their distinctive rhythms. And many animals take turns to vocalize to maximize their chances of being heard. Rapidly developing research is also highlighting how species are affected not only by anthropogenic soundscapes, but also by natural soundscapes. So if we take birds, for example, bird species that vocalize at lower frequencies are affected by anthropogenic sound, whilst those bird species that vocalize at higher frequencies are affected by high-frequency sound levels, for example, from rivers. So both natural and anthropogenic soundscape affect species. And fungi and plants are also affected by sound. So for example, low-frequency sounds stimulate growth in certain fungi, such as the star fungi that we see here on the screen. So from this emerging research, we understand that both anthropogenic and natural soundscape affect species within environments, and that oral diversity extends to the non-human realm within and across species, which makes the assessment, design, and management of multi-species soundscapes a complex task, but also an exciting task as well. So as a response to this emerging knowledge on species and soundscapes within non-human centered fields, the last 2 decades have given rise to substantial research and practice on soundscapes. The interrelated fields of bio and ecoacoustics study biological sound through an ecological lens. In both bio and ecoacoustics, sound is used as a medium to understand what is happening within environments. And I'll come back to this because it's a key difference to how it is understood within human-centered approaches to soundscape assessments. So for example, the ecoacoustic indices that are calculated from sound recordings across temporal and spatial scales can give us information about the richness of a habitat, the complexity of a habitat, or the ratio between anthropogenic and biophonic sound. Ecoacoustic methods can also be used to assess species presence, distribution, and abundance. And as a response to this rapid growth development in research and practice, technical guides have recently been developed aimed at standardizing ecoacoustic monitoring techniques, such as the one that we see on the screen that was done for the UK. It's worth touching here on the definition of soundscape within ecoacoustics and related fields such as soundscape ecology, where the soundscape is primarily understood as the collection of biological, geophysical, and anthropogenic sounds that emanate from a landscape and which vary over space and time, reflecting important ecosystem processes and human activities. So the soundscape, as understood within ecoacoustic, is akin to what the ISO 12913 describes as the acoustic environment. The emphasis here is in the objective study of sound and how it expresses what is happening in the landscape, and can therefore tell us invaluable information about the landscape itself. So this is a key difference from human-centered fields, where the aim is to study the soundscape itself or affective responses to it. So with all these developments taking place in human-centered and non-human-centered fields in parallel, the logical next step is to try and combine them for the assessment, design, and protection of multi-species soundscapes for the health and well-being of all communities. And will be sharing the slides afterwards so you can have a look at the diagrams in detail as well. And there are several barriers to the integration of methods that really start from these different understandings of soundscapes, which then lead to different project aims and different methods. So just to recap on the main differences, when it comes to aims, whereas in human-centered fields, the soundscape is the main object of study. In non-human-centered fields, the soundscape is the medium to study the health and variety of that environment. Whereas in human-centered fields, the soundscape is considered a perceptual construct, and methodology prioritizes subjective assessments. In non-human-centered fields, the soundscape has primarily been considered an objective expression of the landscape, and the methodologies that have followed are objective. Right, so with that introduction to kind of multi-species soundscapes and the complexities that we find when we try and integrate methods, we're now going to have a look at some case studies. And a question that I have been asking myself is precisely how could human-centered methods expand non-human-centered methods and vice versa? So to start to answer this question, I'm going to talk about a small selection of case studies that have attempted to bridge human and non-human soundscape perspectives in different ways. And I have grouped those case studies into 3 categories. So the first category is on multi-species listening, thinking of multi-species listening as the first step or as a first step towards thinking about multi-species soundscapes. A core barrier towards assessing multi-species listening is that we're human, which has obvious limits, but also potential when it comes to embodying the oral diversity that we talked about. So in terms of limits, philosopher Thomas Nagel, back in 1974, so over 50 years ago, in his well-known essay titled "What Is It Like to Be a Bat?", argued that while a human might be able to imagine what it's like to be a bat by taking the bat's point of view, or the bat's point of ear in our case, it would be impossible to know what it is like for a bat to be a bat. I would argue that it is also impossible for me to know what it's like to be either of you, although I can imagine it more easily than if you were all bats, because our sensorial capabilities are more akin to one another. So we cannot be another species, and we cannot be another human, but we can experience and acknowledge that there are multiple points of view or points of ears that are different to our own, and that we need to acknowledge them in soundscape research and practice at a par with human experiences. And philosophers, ecologists, and artists can help us towards that end. I won't touch on philosophy today because we could be here all day. I will talk about ecology, or briefly about ecology and art. So starting with ecology, Mark Bekoff, who is an emeritus professor of ecology and evolutionary biology at the University of Colorado, developed an empathic approach called biocentric anthropomorphism, quite a mouthful that he applied to his field studies. Biocentric anthropomorphism is an approach that takes into consideration the animal's point of view, while at the same time recognizing that we are inherently have an anthropomorphic view of the world. We can mitigate our anthropomorphism by asking ourselves what it's like to be other animals, taking into account in-depth knowledge about their perceptual, emotional, and cognitive capabilities, and by not assuming that emotions are static across the full spectrum of species. So ecologists and biologists can help us grasp the knowledge that we need to get closer to understanding how soundscapes affect species, and empathize and be mindful of those diverse experiences. The more that we know about each species, the more we will be able to adapt our soundscape studies to them. So artists, through a wide range of projects and practices, are also attending to non-human modes of listening. An example is Be the Sea, a collaboration between artists and researcher Ruiz, and composer and lecturer Hayley Jenkins. BDC was a project for the Seascapes landscape partnership that took place in the northeast of England. And this project sought to foreground multi-species listening through various activities. These activities included field recording with communities, deep listening, collaging and sounding activities to attune humans to non-human others and to develop an empathetic relationship with them. So we could think of these projects as an artist's take on biocentric anthropomorphism as well. So in this category of case studies on multi-species listening, I have focused on positive kinds of anthropomorphism, as it has the potential for immediate input into soundscape studies. There are also a wide range of other projects that are exploring at the moment more than human participatory approaches as well, and I will invite you to kind of find out about more afterwards too. The second category of case studies, which is quite different, I've titled Interweaving Ecoacoustics with Soundscape Perception. And these are case studies by researchers in a variety of fields that are increasingly turning their attention to studying links between ecoacoustic indices and human soundscape perception for different purposes. For example, the paper that we have here on the screen by Lawrence and colleagues contextualizes a study that they conducted across 9 urban and peri-urban locations in Bochum, Germany. And these studies sought to link ecoacoustic indices with psychoacoustic perception following the ISO 12913 Part 2 protocol. The idea behind this study was that if ecoacoustic indices could be linked to affective dimensions, then ecoacoustic recordings could be used to assess soundscape perception, which could then help to scale up studies in space and time, because following the soundscape ISO 12913 protocol takes quite a lot of time. So this study found that ecoacoustic indices could indeed be used to identify sound sources of soundscape, and also for some perceptual affective qualities, the perceptual affective qualities of calm, pleasant, annoying, and chaotic. Another example of projects in this category is the Dr. Forest research project that set out to investigate links between forest biodiversity and human health and well-being in Central Europe. And as part of the research, the team sought to link perceived biodiversity with actual biodiversity using photographs and audio recordings taken in forests in Germany, Poland, and Belgium in December of 2020. So with regards to the audio recordings, the team computed acoustic diversity indices and found positive significant correlations between perceived acoustic diversity and actual bird species richness. The team concluded that acoustic diversity indices can be used to quantify aspects of perceived and actual biodiversity, and therefore to manage and plan landscapes to promote both biodiversity and mental well-being. And the last category of case studies are those by urban planners and designers and landscape architects, such as myself, that we're also starting to attend to sound and listening in our practices, extending beyond the ISO 12913 protocols into the realms of ecoacoustics and sound art. So an example of these practices is the Old Pottery, which is one of my projects. The Old Pottery on the outskirts of Corbridge, Northumberland, is a former family-owned Clare pottery that is now protected by English Heritage as an ancient monument. The complex, which you can see there on the left, includes 2 imposing water kilns, and it houses a cottage that you can just about see there, which is home to the owners who are currently devising potential features for the site, and is quite close to one of the main motorways that go from the east to the west of the country as well, the A69. And I was commissioned together with researcher Dan Hill to carry out the landscape design and management for the site. The Old Pottery became our sonic laboratory where we tested, amongst other things, how to integrate aspects of ISO 13913 protocols with ecoacoustics, sound art methods, and everyday landscape architecture practices. Because what you find a lot of the time is that there's lots of research happening in academic institutions, but then when it comes to applying it into practice, if you don't tie it with the practices that people are already using, that research can get lost. So on the screen, we have an example of how we capture findings from soundwalks along listening points on site. And for each of these listening points, we recorded both the sound events as well as the oral effects that we divided into both perceptual oral effects and geophysical oral effects. And this really helped us when it came to the design of the site. This was our starting point. And we also use ecoacoustic methods to identify and monitor key species present on site. So we installed passive sound recordings, audiomods, along one of the hedgerows, at different points of the hedgerows on the boundaries of the pottery. And these audiomods were programmed to record at key intervals over a 24-hour period. And then we analyzed those recordings to identify the species that were present on site, which included woodland, hedgerow, and farmland bird species. Through the integration of ecoacoustic methods, however, we achieved more than that, as those woodland, hedgerow, and farmland birds took a central place in the design process and shaped the creative thinking and the strategic decisions that we took about the pottery's future. So on the screen, we have the core design principles and strategies that we applied to landscape design and management for the site for both humans and birds as well. And the principles were narrative, variety, legibility and coherence, and habitat conservation and enhancement as well. And the strategies, the sonic strategies, we divided into 3 categories: strategies that would apply at the source of the sound event, strategies at the propagation, and strategies at the listener end as well. So we worked at those 3 different points. And on the screen, we have photographs of some of those strategies or interventions that we have already implemented to increase biodiversity with a focus on birds, on the well-being of birds, as well as a focus on increasing the biophony on site as well. So these interventions include meadows that increase invertebrates, which are food for birds. Then we have new planted trees. This is a photo of an old existing tree, and we put also bird houses in new and existing trees, bee bricks for pollinators, and then log piles as well for small mammals and insects too. And you can find out more about this project, including the core soundscape design principles and strategies that I have developed in my book on Arana soundscapes that came out at the end of April last year. So with that, we're coming to the last section of the talk, and I'm returning to the question of how human-centered methods could help us to expand non-human-centered methods and vice versa, reflecting on these case studies that we've talked about. So the first set of case studies on multi-species listening attempt to bring us closer to other listening perspectives, whether through ecological or art approaches or a combination of both. In doing so, they enable us to understand that there are ways of sensing and knowing environments that are different than our own. And applied to soundscape assessment and design, this means that we need to recognize differences between species to ensure that we cater for multiple ways of listening. For example, I talked about how low frequencies have positive effects on certain fungi development, yet they interfere with the vocalization of other birds. So this can give us clues for how we manage that landscape and soundscape. So how can we achieve this? How can we cater for multiple ways of listening? For example, by identifying key species that are currently present on a site, like we did for the old pottery, and then working with ecologists and artists to bring us closer to how those species are affected by soundscapes through applied knowledge. We could then bring those findings to ISO 12003 standards or other assessment protocols through the inclusion of animal personas of key species present on site to ensure that their listening perspectives and affective responses are taken into account. By doing that, we will be practicing biocentric anthropomorphism. The second feature case study demonstrated the potential for integrating ecoacoustics and soundscape persistent methods, the two research projects that I talked about. The first case study in Germany demonstrated the potential expansion of soundscape assessments in place and time through the relation between ecoacoustics and affective dimensions. And the Dr. Forrest study, the potential for integrating biodiversity with health and well-being studies through sound. Oops, this has gone all wrong. And the last case study, the all-party sought to integrate multiple soundscape methods, which for us requires the expansion of the understanding of the soundscape itself. So within human-centered fields, as I've discussed, the soundscape is a perceptual construct. Within ecoacoustic, the soundscape is the oral expression of the landscape. At the old portrait and in my book, we envisage the soundscape as a combination of both, as the oral expression of the natural environment, including its communities, and the medium to perceive and interact with that environment. This is in line with recent attempts to expand the definition of the soundscape itself, both within ecoacoustics and human soundscape fields. So within soundscape ecology, within ecoacoustic, Arana and colleagues have proposed a more nuanced definition of the soundscape, which you can see there in the middle. A soundscape is a sonoscope that has been cognitively interpreted into a mosaic of semiotic categories of geophysical, biological, and human-generated sounds by an organism, and in turn they define a sonoscope as the mosaic of all uninterpreted sonic information of a landscape. So this definition proposes that the soundscape is also a perceptual construct for species that can cognitively interpret sound. In turn, there has also been a call to expand the ISO 12003 definition of the soundscape and its emphasis on human perception and context, with a proposed new definition of a soundscape is the auditory environment of a place, setting, or community whose character is the result of the interaction with non-auditory and/or contextual factors. Applied to the old portrait, this expanded definition of soundscape enables us to study it as an integral part of the landscape character assessment. The landscape character assessment protocols that we currently use in practice and in research also relate to the landscape definition that came out of the European Landscape Convention of 20,000 that I mentioned at the beginning. These assessment protocols combine the study of natural layers, of cultural layers, and intersubjective layers of the landscape, as summarized in the diagram that you see there. And in practice, we assess landscape character as we don't provide an effective evaluation of the character, but rather compare character according to its difference. So landscape character is defined as a distinctive and recognized pattern of elements or characteristics in the landscape that make one landscape different from another rather than better or worse. So by integrating this process at the old portrait, we consider the soundscape as an expression of the natural and cultural processes of the landscape, and also as a mediator of the experience of the landscape, therefore trying to bridge different aims of current human and non-human soundscape practices. In my book, this combined approach led me to propose 3 interrelated modes of environmental listening that are applicable to soundscape assessment, which are listening as communication to understand a place and its community, and so to try and understand what the sound is expressing about the landscape. Then listening as an aesthetic pursuit, contributing to how a place is valued by its inhabitants. And lastly, listening as a source of affective engagement with the environment. And over the past months, I have been looking at expanding those three modes of listening to include submodalities within them, as you see on that rough diagram, and also to think about this, how could these modes of listening be applied to other species as well? And this would be something to develop over the coming years in my research. So these integrated modes of listening and this expanded conceptualization of landscape could lead to the integration of aims and methods in both human and non-human centered fields as they become complementary. So to summarize, the soundscape as a perceptual construct for humans and non-humans exposes how noise is a matter of degree for all species, helping us to fine-tune current soundscape assessment according to the communities that are present on site. And in turn, the study of the soundscape as an oral expression of the landscape reveals information about the whole landscape, its physical and cultural makeup, and that of its communities, helping us to integrate soundscape within broader landscape assessments. So what next? Decentering humans in soundscape assessment, design, and management is a complex task, as I have hopefully conveyed, that starts by expanding and integrating the understanding of soundscape, because that then leads to different project aims and different methods. And to follow up on this line of thought, at the moment I'm working on a conference paper for Journals 2025 together with Gunnar Sarwan, who is a fellow landscape architect and researcher at SLU, Arana, Sweden. We are putting together a framework for multi-species soundscape characterization that draws from landscape-led approaches, in particular the landscape character assessment wheel that I have just shown you. We're looking to integrate different methods from various fields to assess natural, cultural, and experiential aspects of the soundscape. So if you're interested in finding out more, let me know, and I'll keep you updated on that one. And finally, we're just about to launch a sound and environment research group at Newcastle University, which will sit within one of the centers for research excellence at the university, the Landscape Center for Research Excellence, and will bring together researchers from across all faculties. And it will be led by Dr. Rob Mackay, who is a senior lecturer in music composition, and myself as well. And with that, I conclude and let you ask any questions or provide feedback, thoughts.
Very much for a fascinating talk. I expect we've got some questions. Anyone want to ask a question? Welcome.
Hello.
Hello.
Presentation. I also had a chance to see you present at Internoise as well.
Oh, great.
So I work on air source heat patterns and looking into human response, but this got me thinking about non-human response. So I was thinking if a rural village or a large-scale residential development starts using heat pump altogether, would its influence on the soundscape will any effect on the biodiversity? See that as a potential issue.
Can you repeat the question?
So like if a residential development
Yeah.
starts using open air source heat pumps on a large scale in a rural environment, will that's influence on the soundscape will have any effect on surrounding biodiversity?
Okay, so the question for the online attendees is whether in a residential development, the installation of heat pumps will affect biodiversity as well as
Very low frequency dominance.
Potentially, yes. The fungi might love it. So you might get lots of it, mostly if it's a shady area as well. So it depends on what kind of biodiversity you're looking to. I think a key aspect there is to think about the species that are already present on the site and how it might affect them, because it affects differently different species, but it could potentially affect vocalizing birds as well as other species. Not the fungi, but others. Yes. So that's where it becomes quite complex, because different species like different things.
Thank you. Any other questions? Bill?
Hi, thanks very much for your talk, which I thoroughly enjoyed. I'm Bill Davis. I don't know. First of all, I suppose a very brief comment. I can see lots of links between what you're talking about and existing projects here, and also things that we talked about. We have a Horizon project called Plan B, which is attempting to assess the effects of noise on all terrestrial non-human animals across Europe, which is something ambitious. And well, you know,
Yeah.
Ridiculous.
No.
Yeah, and kind of nice to see you mention all biodiversity, and pleasing to you kind of acknowledge and tackle that kind of that irritating difference between the way the term soundscape is used in the different fields, and yeah, I wish people would acknowledge more exactly what we're talking about. But sorry, an actual question. You mentioned like some sort of potential human modes of listening. I've seen lots of suggestions for different kinds of listening in humans. Do you think non-human animals have different kinds of listening?
So there's something that the question is whether different non-human animals have different modes of listening as well. And I believe that they do, in the same way that they vocalize for different things. So there might be bird calls to alert other birds of things, whereas there are bird songs for other purposes as well. So I do believe that birds make art too, not only, it's not only communication. So it's something that I have been asking myself, which led me to develop those modes of listening into that as well, because it was the question that I was asking myself. There's all this research. There's a great book by Nicolas Mathepon, who is a biologist, French biologist. He's published a book, The Voices of Nature, I think it's called, and talks about all experiments about putting speakers next to animals and see what they do and what they don't do. And it's just fascinating. So this really led me to believe that, yes, there are different modes of listening also within species. Can I categorically say it? No, because I am not one of them. But I would like to take the view that, yes, there are, because there is plenty of research that is, I guess, proving us that the vocalizations have different purposes, which would then make us think that listening would follow as well.
People at the back.
David, go on then.
Hello, I'm David Waddington.
No.
In addition to being Professor in Acoustics here, I'm also currently the president of the Institute of Acoustics. You may be aware of a meeting that was at Malmet on Biosea. Were you at that meeting about 2 years ago?
Yes, I was. Yeah.
Yeah, you may remember me being there. You may remember Mark Holgeroyd talking about an EPSRC program around. There have been steps made towards doing this. Speaking louder because of the microphone online might be interesting. And at the moment, we're talking about a meeting at the Institute of Acoustics on June the 4th. And The working title is Quieter Terrestrial Ecosystem Noise Management. I'd be very interested to know from your work what you'd like to see in an EPSRC program grant.
Well, one of the things I would like to see is different disciplines represented. I think it would be really great to include people from the arts as well, because of what they bring in trying to bring us closer to those other modes of listening as well. And of course, ecology as well. I think it's amazing what you can do when you bring people from different fields together. And I think we don't do it enough. Because then you get different perspective, but also different knowledge that help us expand. And that would be the first starting point. I would love to attend on the June the 4th if that was possible.
Who else would you like to see then?
I will have a little think about who I would like to see there, because as I say, it would be good to have people. Well, you were at the meeting, so there's quite a lot of people with expertise within ecoacoustics that would be great to be there. Like Carlos Abrams, for example, with his expertise. But it could be good to have some people from the arts as well.
The conversation will pick up within BioC, and the lady that's leading it at the moment is Helen Whitehead. Do you know Helen?
No.
So if you could communicate with Helen, and I'll mention it to her by email.
Yeah.
That you'd like to be involved. And I think we could pick up some momentum on that. But there could be people online that are interested. I noticed, I think it was Rena come online, but she may have gone again. And you tell Becky she's still
Yeah,
there.
she's still there. Oh, yeah.
Any comments from Rena?
Hello, sorry, I was distracted. What do you need from me? Sorry.
Mute it. Sorry, we're going to use
Right.
on mute on our end.
Can you hear me now?
There we go. Try again.
Can you hear me now?
Thanks, Simone, that'd be great.
Strange.
It's coming out speakers right at the back somewhere.
Oh, right.
Seriously. That's the screens.
Maybe what I might suggest is that if you send me your slides later, and then people can get in touch by email.
I'll just mention the reason why I asked about Rena. Rena recently wrote an article about this from a consultancy perspective. This will be important to us because we want to generate impact with what we do. Obviously, the best thing to do is to get it into something like building regs, and I know we're talking about biodiversity net gain at the moment, because then people have to use it, and then we know that the work that we're using is valuable. That's why I wanted Rena to comment.
Yeah. I think dealing with the biodiversity net gain would be great, and also because the discussions are happening at the moment of some of the problems for its implementation as well. So if it's in revision, that would be the great time to revise it even more. To do that.
Good, that's a very valuable point. We need to engage with the policymakers now.
Your question?
Yeah. I was interested. So the slide on the old pottery and the different approaches. I noticed one struck my eye, the singing lines for bird habitats.
Yes.
What is a singing line? Could you
Well,
elaborate?
It's a space for birds to sing and make art.
Right.
It's giving them the habitats that they need to communicate. I think one of the things that really struck us when with the passive sound recorders, we were listening to some of their recordings, and there was a beautiful one where they seem to really be having a conversation, and two birds seem to be having a conversation next to the speaker. And this became the starting point of a oralization that we did. I haven't talked about oralizations today, but we worked with creative oralizations. So not only oralizations that you do at the end of a project, but rather thinking creatively through sound the same way that we do with drawings. So that kind of bird conversations became the starting point of I guess a music composition as well. So the singing lines are giving them the space that they need to come together and sing. One of the things the old portray is that the existing trees are all in the perimeter of the site, but there's not many trees within them. So these singing lines were meant to connect those existing trees.
Connect between the trees.
Yeah.
So did you engineer your interventions into the environments to facilitate these? Because I envision it as kind of channels. Because
yeah. It was about providing more connection between existing trees within the site, so that would increase the biophony within the site itself, as opposed to keeping it to the perimeter of the site. I guess the singing line is a bit of a poetic allowance in that.
I actually have a question, if that's all right. It's probably quite a naive question. This is in my area, but so what happens if the animals don't like the soundscape? Basically, like, do you see measurable effects on their health or their habits or anything like that?
It depends. So there's been many different studies depending on the species. With birds, for example, if they are closer to an airport, they will start singing earlier to avoid interference in their vocalization. There were lots of studies done as well during COVID, when the world went into quiet mode as well. And there was a study, I think it was California, looking at a particular bird species, and what they found is that the richness of the song greatly increased. So they go into I guess, a more simplified call that it still enables to do what it needs to do, but it doesn't have the richness that it does. So it does affect in different ways according to the species as well. I'm fascinated in Newcastle. We have a colony of kittiwakes. That we have the most inland colony of kittiwakes. I'm based in Newcastle. Inland colony of kittiwakes in the world. So we're 11 miles away from the sea. They usually are in cliffs. They come in February and they stay there until August. So they come to spend the summer in the UK. But they are in bridges of heavy traffic. So I'm fascinated by how they can stand. They're mating the nest starter within and the technology is just unbelievable. So it's very much depends on the species and the situation. But yes, there are effects. Obviously, we cannot ask them to fill in a questionnaire.
That's what I think it is with people. Yeah. You ask them, how are you feeling? How stressed are you? How, Any further questions? We don't have anything online, I don't think. Oh, Thomas Deacon has his hand up.
Can I be heard?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. I just wondered, great talk. Nice to see you again. I was wondering what you think the limits are on the sort of human empathy relationality with animals are, just so that we can kind of be honest about our expectations with what we can do with it, but then also that I think that links to the ecoacoustic needs as well, personally. But just like where do you fall on that issue?
Oh, that's a great question. And nice to see you as well. So it's something I think I've been going into deep listening more deeply. So I'm currently completed an intensive course with the Center for Deep Listening as well. And I think that the potential is great to develop empathy in the way that we develop empathy with other humans without being that other human. And the more that you relate to other species, the more empathy that you develop. It becomes complex when it comes to species that we don't really like. And so, for example, rats. So there are species that are not so nice looking, or we don't consider them as well, but they're still beings. So it is a very complex area. And I think in landscape architecture, we tend to develop visuals with the animals that we're going to attract with our interventions. And they're quite idealistic visuals as well. You will never see a rat in there or a pigeon. So you only see the nice ones. And I think we need to break that as well. I think the potential is great, but I think it's very complex too.
On the pigeons one, like this is a personal side story thing. The understanding the history of pigeons, that we used them so much in our communications and to do the war, World War I, stuff like that. Once you know that history and you realize that we domesticated that animal and now they reside in urban centers because of us in a lot of ways, that I think layers of history and layers of understanding of context and how we've changed the environment too comes into repositioning the impacts we have, because we've already done it. Like we can't know everything from this point, but at least we can look backwards as well and feel those different layers, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And I think with pigeons, the kind of populations are increasing as well because of the bird feeders that we put in gardens as well. They quite like them too. But yes, I think it's this breaking down what species we should protect and what's a pest and what's an animal to be protected. I think is key as well.
Just as an advert for those interested in more than human design, there's an event starting on the 11th of July in 2025 at the Design Museum. It's a big exhibition on more than human stuff. It runs from July to October. So if you're interested in this, there's going to be more stuff happening. I just wanted to share the good stuff.